because we only encounter Buddhas, because we are Buddhas, we can pretend to be Buddhas. Therefore, practice is to enable us to be the Buddha we are, to reveal to us, to clarify our life to be the Buddha life, or to discover how, where, when we are refusing to be the Buddha we are, being entangled in greed, in anger, in confusions. I've recently been encouraging many of you to take up a practice that Joko suggested, a practice which is appropriate and in response to circumstances at times, especially when we find reactive habits arising, reactive habits entangling, practice of saying to ourselves or out loud, "Thanks for everything. I have no complaints whatsoever." What is responding and functioning as "thanks for everything, I have no complaints whatsoever" to circumstances, to the complaints we have, to difficult circumstances? What might this be? In a way, this is a straightforward practice, seemingly simple, and yet it calls forth the need for great doubt, great determination, and great faith. And these are likewise required for traditional koan practice and various other forms of practice, of life practice. And one of the things we get to notice is "thanks for everything, I have no complaints whatsoever" goes against our natural, seemingly natural, reactions of greed, of anger, of changing circumstances of life, of what we do not want, do not like, what is difficult or painful, what's not in our plans, resentments, anger about the past and present may arise, unfortunately often unnoticed. And those may make simple activities difficult. Sometimes we will discover all sorts of things we are avoiding. Thanks for everything as a practice makes use of these habitual reactions. You could call them reactions to impermanence, to ongoing changing circumstances, even powerful circumstances such as natural disasters or wars of all sorts, violence of all sorts, and reactions, whether ours or that of others, that are not skillful, reactions which entangle and which get us caught up in anger, in greed, in worse. How and what is the practice in the midst of this? Thanks for everything. How is that a practice opportunity? How can we make that into a practice opportunity to support us in seeing and being who we are and doing what is skillful now to the best of our ability? Many of you know that at the beginning of every day in Sesshin, we do a gatha of atonement. For those who don't know this, it goes, all harmful actions ever committed by me since of old, all harmful actions ever committed to me since of old, on account of beginningless greed, anger, and ignorance, born of body, mouth, and thought, now I acknowledge and am at one with them all. In the version that we do, there's an additional line that isn't there in the traditional one, which is the line of all harmful actions ever committed to me since of old. Many years ago, I discussed this with Joko, the utility and value of this added line. And she thought it was a good idea, but I waited a number of years after our discussion before adding it to our practice at PZC. Please hear how the two phrases, thanks for everything, I have no complaints whatsoever, also echoes in all harmful actions ever committed to me since of old. This to me added to by me is interesting if we just attend to it. One of the things, whether it's we say to me or by me, is to discover anger, resentment, and hurt, and more that have been maybe for events of 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or even longer. Sometimes we discover as we practice, if we are honest and willing to see it, that there is this anger, greed, and so forth that arises in thoughts and feelings and beliefs, whether in our formal sitting or in daily life. And sometimes we refuse to acknowledge this, much less practice with this. And thanks for everything and the Gatha of Atonement are both opportunities for us over and over in practice to discover and see what's skillful. And yet at times we cling to anger, rising anger beliefs, and maybe even act them out. So, Dharma practice opportunities. As you know, we, in the Bodhisattva's vow, which we sometimes chant in the service, there's the phrase, if by any chance she should turn against us, become a sworn enemy, and abuse and persecute us, we should sincerely bow down with humble language and the reverent understanding that she is the merciful manifestation of the awakened life, which uses devices to emancipate us from blind tendencies produced and accumulated upon ourselves by our own egoistic delusion and attachment through countless cycles of space and time. Even when she, he, they, life seems to turn against us. Here again, an echo of this thanks for everything in this Bodhisattva's vow. In a way, you could say thanks for everything is a condensation of Bodhisattva's vow. When I, a student of the way, look at the real form of the universe. If I say it, thanks for everything, I have no complaints whatsoever, enables us, enables you, enables me to remind ourselves to be the real form of the universe which we are, to be the Bodhisattva we are. Now, Joko brought up this practice of ongoing thanks for everything, no complaints. Even as complaints and no thanks arise in our mind, in our actions, in our words, in the world, in the ongoing practice. Now, some of you might say, oh, Joko's life was easy, so she can say this sort of thing, but my life. So I just want to add one thing to appreciate that Joko's life experience and practice, including grew out of her having lived this. Lest you say, Joko didn't appreciate having as hard times. I'll just bring up one thing. Some of you know and some of you don't, that Joko was married to and lived with a husband who was mentally ill and violently attacked her, abused her and others in the family. And despite this, Joko encourages this thanks for everything. I bring this up about Joko, but we should know that this is also in similar ways the practice that many of Shakyamuni Buddha's early disciples had to go through, having lived through very difficult times. On one hand, especially Shakyamuni Buddha's early woman practitioners, they included queens and royalty, and those from wealthy families include, as some of you know, Mahapajapati, his Shakyamuni's stepmother, his wife, and others, which are people from comfortable, wealthy circumstances. But also many of the Bhikkhunis that the Buddha practiced with, and many of whom became accomplished arhats under the Buddha or under his early disciples, were widows, sometimes with no supports financially or familiarly. Some were abused wives who had left home, run away from home and family. Some had been courtesans. And we are all familiar with the woman whose infant child dies and she comes to the Buddha because she's been told he can resurrect the child, and he gives her instruction to find a seed. Sometimes it says a poppy seed, sometimes a sesame seed, from a home where no one has died. The rest of that story, most of you are familiar with, and if you want, you can look in the texts for it. She too eventually becomes a arhat under the Buddha, accomplished. Many of these bhikkhuni, early women practitioners under Buddha, have written poems both regarding their own practice and accomplishment, but also bringing up some of their previous life experiences which led them to practice. There's a very good translation of it called the Therigathapali, book of verse of elder Bhikkhunis, and Mushin will link to that. And there's another text that's Theragathapali, which is the verses of the male disciples, and we'll link to that as well. I want to just bring up a few of the things that some of these women talked about, which led them to practice. Some talk, one woman, one bhikkhuni, I should say, talks about how having an unborn child dying in breach, that was very difficult. Another talked about nearing the childbirth time. While she was traveling to her parents' home, she saw her dead husband on the road. Having born on the way without having reached my own house, she says. Another one speaks of having two sons die, her husband lying dead on the path. She was miserable. Mother, father, brother are all found burning on the same cremation pile, she says. Another one writes, familyless, not having a family, miserable, immeasurable suffering, tears flowing. Another talks of living in a cemetery, eating flesh of dead, even the flesh of her son. Family destroyed, blamed by all, widowed. I'll read one last one. I am poor, widow and without sons, without friends and relatives, without food and clothes. There's many more like this. So please know that these practices, and I bring this up in part because in a way this practice is thanks for everything, I have no complaints. One of the complaints that I hear is I don't have no complaints. I don't have thanks for everything. I have such and such difficulty and such difficulty. But it's important and valuable to know that practice is for us to be able to see how can we practice in the midst of this impermanence, this greed, anger, confusions, whether it's so-called ours or so-called others. How do we practice? We talk about even practicing in the midst of difficult situations, natural disasters, wars. There's war that's been going on in Ukraine for many months, people killed, families killed, injured. This week, last few days, there's this attacks and war now in Israel. People killed, children killed, people taken prisoner. How do we practice with that? What use is something like thanks for everything, I have no complaints? And yet, this is what Joko and others, this is what Bodhisattvas vow, this is what Gatha of Atonement call us to see how to practice in the midst of impermanence. This is what encouraged Shakyamuni Buddha to begin practicing old age, sickness, dying, death. And this practice, if we can see how to do this skillfully, allows us, encourages us, enables us to be the Bodhisattva we are, to live the life of the Bodhisattva and Buddha that we are. Thank you for your practice.